Welcome to the recap video, a ministry of First Baptist Kettering, where we get together each week and talk about the things that we've been preaching on, things that are happening in the church, our mission and values and measures. And so we are glad you're here. Let's jump on in. David, this past week, I missed, you missed.
Yeah.
And so it was Joe and Daryl and Patrick. And
So let me say for the first time on the recap, Happy New Year.
Hey, Happy New Year
to everyone.
Yeah, they got together and talked about developing ministry leaders and opportunities to preach and what that's like. So you and I were both out, and we're both back this past Sunday, and we started a new sermon series. Tell us about what we did.
Yeah, Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, you know, it was really an overview, I guess. It was an introductory sermon to Genesis. And you said at the very beginning, we're going to just kind of touch on some of those bigger picture things. We weren't going to get into some of those intricate, debatable issues that a lot of people kind of hope for. The same thing when we did Revelation. I think there was a crowd that was like when we did that little mini
charts and maps out.
Yeah, it's like, Revelation, we're going to talk about the end times, and the same thing for this.
And there's a place for that.
Absolutely.
There's a place
and I
for
think
that.
both of us said at both campuses that we're gonna get around to some of that. And my challenge to the folks at Eastmont is to spend some time in their small groups if they're doing the sermon-based outlines that we provide, and dig deeper into some of that stuff. I know our group is going to do that this Thursday. They've already told me. After the service, they were like, "Hey, can we talk more about this and this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, man, let's dig in." We have more time to do that. But yeah, it was. I know you focused on some of those bigger things like the voice of God, and just those things. God spoke it into existence. The ownership, his sovereignty and his ownership of all things. Since he is the creator, he has authority. And so we kind of hit on some of those points as well. But
I think sometimes when we get into texts like that, again, it's great to be able to study the minute portions, single words, phrases, concepts. But sometimes if we get so focused on a verse or an idea within a text, we miss the broad context of what God's trying to show us or teach us about himself in that passage. And my introduction to my message was really about the fact that I believe that this is an introduction to who God is. Not just to where did we come from, while it certainly addresses where did we come from, but we have to remember that Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 is written within the whole Pentateuch, which is really about a series of covenants that God creates with his people to be in relationship with them. And so we don't just carve out Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 and say, well, that's way back here, and then God starts a relationship. No, Genesis 1:1 is where God starts this initiation of covenant relationship, and he does so by what? Creating man, creating all of the world, all the things that have ever existed.
Touch on, if you will, your first point. God has a name. Touch on that a little bit.
We could have spent a month in the first verse.
Yeah.
In the beginning. Okay, well, let's talk about what is the beginning, and you could unpack that and unpack that and unpack that. But the real point is that there was time before everything was created. And I went through that. Jesus talks about that in John chapter 17 and other places where God existed before anything was created. Because you have to have someone, the creator, who is outside of creation, that can speak it into existence, that was before anything else was, because you can't have nothing out of nothing, but you can have nothing out of something, which is what God did. When he created ex nihilo, out of nothing, in the Latin. And so, we talked about in the beginning, what is the beginning? And then we talked about who was in the beginning. It was God. And that word there, name for God, is Elohim. And it's plural. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that this week when we get into verse 26. But just to kind of tease it a little bit, it wasn't just the Father that was involved in creation. It was the Trinity.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God.
And the Word was
Yeah,
God.
and that was a good lead in into your second point, which God has a voice.
He does. He speaks.
That's good stuff.
He
That's
speaks.
really
What
good
did you
stuff.
What did you guys hit on when you're talking about God speaking?
Well, I think we hit on that. I think, is it 6 or 7
Yeah.
times in that passage up to verse 25,
And
where
God
he just
said,
says, "And God said, and God said," and that was enough. I mean, just the focusing on the fact that the power of just being able to speak it. If you believe that, and most Christians, hopefully, they have to believe in the resurrection. If you believe that Jesus can die and come back to life, then science or no science, you can believe in faith, which is why we attached, I'm sure, Faith Walker as one of our measures to this particular sermon. We can believe that God created the heavens and the earth just with a spoken word.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And I mean, I just think about all the times in the scripture where God speaks something and it happened. Like I immediately think about Jesus at Lazarus' tomb. Lazarus, come forth. Yeah. And he calls the dead out of the grave with his voice. And it's so interesting because I have conversations with Christians, not a lot, but sometimes where they'll be like, I have no problem believing in the miracles of Jesus, but I just have a real problem believing in literal 7-day creation. And I'm thinking, why? I mean, the same God that can call Lazarus out of the grave, the same God who can speak to the wind and the waves and say, peace be still, and they calm. Why would he be limited in power that he could not say with his mouth, let there be, and boom, there is? I mean, if he's limited, if he requires more time or more whatever to do that, then he's not really God. And I think sometimes we want to, dismiss miracles that we either try to explain away in other ways or we have a hard time understanding. And I think we do that to our own detriment and in an attempt to diminish the authority and power of God.
Yeah, and I think I had a lot of fun focusing on the ownership of God over creation. I mean, because he created it, he has that authority, the ownership over those whom he created. And I went to other places, Job and the Psalms, that speak to him having authority and owning everything. And because he created it, that gives him ownership.
Yeah, I love that passage in Job 38.
Oh, absolutely. And that was a cross-reference.
Job has just got all kind of questions, right? And God's just like, okay, sit down, and it's time for me to talk. And if you have an answer to the questions I'm going to ask you, then you can come at it. But it basically says there, put on your big boy pants, right? Dress like a man, or as in old King James, it says, gird up your loins. And I told the congregation here, I was like, I'm not exactly sure what gird up your loins means, but I don't think it's a real good thing. But he basically says, kind of, let's pony up here. It's time to talk about the brass tacks of what you're asking. But that's how it is. I mean, that's where we are. When God speaks, it's true. And we weren't there. And he says, this is how I did it. And who am I, the creation, to speak back to the creator?
Right. And a little bit, we're going to get into this when we get into Adam and Eve and the fall. Because he owns everything and he created everything, he has the authority to say, you can do this. You shouldn't do this. And you shouldn't do this because I love you. Yeah. Right. And so I'm we are accountable to that.
Yes. Right. So he has the authority and we are held accountable to his authority. And like you said, we'll see that throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, that when we obey and when we follow our creator, there's blessing involved. Yeah. And when we don't, there is punishment and consequence involved. Yeah. And even though we'll see consequence, what we'll also see is grace. Yeah. And I love the fact that throughout the book of Genesis, even before, we see the Son, the Word become flesh, we see the grace of God and the mercy of God extended to his people.
I spent a little time talking about darkness and water and the judgment that we see, especially in the Old Testament, how God used darkness and water. When you think about the judgment of the flood and the water, the flood rushing over the Egyptians, when he was delivering Israel, his children, that and just even in his judgments, there's a goodness. And that's kind of how I ended talking about the goodness of God. And he saw it, he spoke it into existence. He saw it and he said, this is good. This is good. This is good. And that's kind of where we ended But he says it one more time, and we're going to
very
good
good
when we're talking about the image of God,
Yeah.
Humans being created in the image of God. It's very good, and I'm really looking forward to that next week.
Yeah. So what are you thinking about as you're preparing? I know we talked a little bit earlier. What do you think? Where's God taking you this week as we finish chapter 1?
Well, I know we're early, and I'm going to try my best not to open up my laptop and cheat. But we talked earlier today. I think focusing on some of those doctrines that the church tends to overlook, the doctrine of God, His deity. We're going to get back in, as you said earlier, Elohim, just the Trinity being present at creation. And so I think we're going to start there because that's really where verse 26 picks up, and then the image of God, creating man, and what goes into that, including that's the doctrine of man, but also sexuality and God's plan and purpose for His creation. He has a plan, dominion over all creation. It's really stewardship. So I think I'm going to focus on stewardship. That God has given us to take care of the things that He's created, as well as His divine order for the home. It plays into Genesis chapter 1, the end of Genesis chapter 1. So I'm really looking forward. Tough preaching. Especially in this culture that we live in today. But we have an opportunity to put the spotlight on God's plan and purpose for creation, and so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about what it means to be an image bearer. That we're made in the image of God, and what does that mean, and how does that impact every part of our life if we are image bearers, and what does that mean about how we treat other people? Because whether or not they are walking with Jesus, whether or not they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, they still, because they are made in His likeness, there is some things that we have to take into consideration as we consider how we treat one another, how we love one another, how we share with one another. And so there's a lot there. You've mentioned some of them. There's just a lot of good things to unpack, and I'm excited about it.
There is. And we won't ever touch all of it, all of it, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for watching and participating with us. If you have comments, we'd love for you to leave them below. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please hit that like and subscribe button so that you can get future content as it becomes available. And we want you to go out this week, wherever you may be, and be the church.